Hey, welcome back to Common Mansplaining, everyone. I'm Eddie, that's Christian, and today we have a treat for you. I have a guest on the show. Her name is Nina, and we're going to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Nina has a lot of hands-on experience in this area, and so I'll let her introduce herself and familiarize the audience with who you are and what you do and everything, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Thank you both, Eddie and Christian, for having
Yeah,
me
welcome aboard.
today. My name is Nina Ng. I am originally a nurse from New York City. I'm also the president and founder of an NGO called Help Me Live USA. And yes, I have been to Gaza several times, and my NGO continues to have missions in Gaza where we sponsor medical clinics, schools, and also aid like food, water, and winter distributions.
That is awesome. And that is, I want to thank you, first of all, for being like part of the solution, I think, as opposed to part of the problem, because this is a very high tension topic. And it's definitely, it, anytime war is involved, it's atrocious. I mean, the horrors of war can never be overstated. And it's so nice to be, on the side of somebody who's trying to rebuild things and try to get help out to people. So thank you for that. Thank you for your service to humanity. And
no. First, just some grounders. I just sort of interested a little bit about your NGO. Why is it focused just on Gaza, not on the West Bank? And is it on any other Arab communities that are underserved? Yeah.
So we've actually recently made trips to Jordan and Lebanon. Before I formed my own NGO, I worked for other NGOs as a director. And even before that, I volunteered in multiple places like Haiti. I worked almost a year when the Ukraine and Russia war first broke out. And I've also been in Iraq for their last war in 2017.
Your credentials are I'm not questioning I'm not questioning your credentials. I'm questioning that your particular charity, is it focused just on Gaza, or does it also provide medical services, the things you're talking about, in other parts of the Middle East, or just Gaza? That's what I was wondering.
Gaza primarily. My NGO is actually only 1 year old.
Okay.
So we started actually at the U.S.-Mexico border with migrants who were there.
Nice.
Then we focused on mostly Gaza last year, and now we've expanded to doing assessments and also some interventions in Jordan and in Lebanon.
Nice.
So maybe I'll lead into this. Why do you feel like there was a need for NGO from America versus why was this need not being met by countries that have a proximity much closer to the area? Why America?
Traditionally, in a lot of war zone responses, there are actually NGOs from all over the world. So you'll see European NGOs, you'll see some of the, let's say, bigger players like Doctors Without Borders or IMC, International Medical Corps. It doesn't necessarily always depend on like where the country is from. It's more of like the NGO's interest to respond and trying to be a part of helping those in need. So there are actually also NGOs from Indonesia, from Malaysia, and even I've seen that in Gaza. So for me, even though I am an American, I'm a Chinese American, and because my upbringing was in the U.S., my NGO is formed in the U.S., and therefore I have a U.S. NGO. But there isn't any particular reason for me to say like, oh, because we're Americans, we want to respond to this or that. It's more of, if something happens in the world, like if there's a natural disaster somewhere and we have the ability to respond, then we may do that, regardless where it is. Involved.
All right.
Yeah. So she's go wherever the help is needed. That makes sense.
All right, cool. Yeah. So you just kind of want to understand that. That's all. All right, go ahead, Eddie.
Sure. So I was trying to come up with how to start this best, and this is a very, very high, like I said, it's a very emotionally charged topic. Where do you guys think the fork in the road is in the two sides, the two viewpoints involved? And I'll start with Christian. Where do you think like the divide is in the philosophy as far as why one side thinks that Israel has a greater claim, say, to the land, perhaps, or why Palestine has greater claim to the land, or why one side in the war would be favored over the other, that sort of thing? Good.
Well, I think part of it is, right, you talk about emotions. I feel like a lot of the arguments on the side of the Palestinians are emotions, and there's a lot of anger. Um, and the side of sort of, let's get down and like think about this, uh, a little more analytical, I think, tend to go back in favor of Israel. Because basically there's no place in the Middle East, no Muslim countries where Jews are safe. But Jews are safe to live in Israel. Arabs that choose that, as long as they recognize that Israel has a right to exist as a real country, they can live in Israel. And I think, to a large degree, Americans side on Israel's side because we feel like we would rather live in a government similar to run by Israel than a government run by Hamas. That for me feels much safer and much more aligned with my experience. And I feel like a lot of that Palestine has decided that their answer, how they want to resolve their disagreements with Israel, is through violence. That's the mode that they have chosen. And it happens that their opponent, Israel, is better at violence than they are. And so when they try to solve things via violence, it doesn't end well for them. And then they don't accept the consequences of that. Usually, like, there's a consequence to starting a war and losing a war. A consequence that they don't want. And all we really think that Israel wants, for the most part, is for them to stop hating them and trying to attack them. Just acknowledge that Israel's going to be here. Israel's not going anywhere. They're a legitimate country. And then you can come and live peacefully with us. The people of Palestine feel very emotionally. They can never acknowledge Israel and have an emotional connection and a desire that leads them to violent ends. And that's something that when we here, who are not party to either ethnicities or religions, look upon in a calm, analytical way and think is irrational and is not sympathetic. If that makes sense.
What do you think about that, Nina?
From a humanitarian aid perspective, what I will say, even in my own history and working in other areas, I don't always get 100% into the politics. Gaza has felt a little bit different because it's one of the first responses where we actually have to work with all parties. And I'll give you an example. For example, we often go where we are called to. So wherever the United Nations and the World Health Organization set up and then ask for all the NGOs to come and put a response there. I have friends of mine, as I mentioned, I have Jewish friends from childhood. They've even asked me, and out of really like innocence and not knowing, they've said, well, why don't NGOs go to Israel? So my response to that was we weren't invited, number one. Number two, Israel has infrastructure and the hospitals to take care of their own, and they haven't asked or requested for international aid. So when we talk about some of like who does the land belong to or how does Hamas versus Israel work, the way humanitarians come into this, and this is also, again, I like to add comparisons because when I was in Iraq, it was Iraqi military and U.S., Canadian, and coalition forces, so some European countries as well, versus ISIS, okay? And where the comparison might come to is like ISIS and Hamas are similar. But when we come into these situations, we're actually expected to be neutral and to take care of whoever appears at our doorsteps. So if we set up points in Iraq or Ukraine or in Gaza, and whether it's a Russian soldier, Israeli soldier, or Hamas or a civilian, we're actually expected to take care of everyone. And then whatever happens after, the further comparison I can give you is like when I'm working in New York City hospitals. And as you know, we have many mass shootings nowadays, and this has actually happened to some of my colleagues in some of the hospitals. Ooh. If the gunmen were to appear, and even though they might be actually trying to shoot us or have already shot many people, we still have to take care of them. Whoa. We take care of any victims involved who come to our, we have to take care of anyone who comes to our doorstep. And in the end, that is the basis of humanitarian aid, right? We present ourselves, we come in without arms, we don't have our own protection. We are also disposable in the sense that humanitarians are often killed and become casualties in these settings. So for Gaza, it's no different, right? It just depends on what happens. So where
So when
again,
you're
where we
there,
are called to.
you're not getting emotional. Is what you're saying. You're trying to be. You're just
It's
trying to
not that I'm
serve
not getting
whoever's
emotional.
bleeding. You're just trying to put a bandage on whoever's bleeding.
When we're on the front lines, yes, there's no doubt that we hold emotions for what we see. So, for the example of what's happening between Gaza and Israel, and Palestine and Israel, however you want to say it, Hamas and Israel,
Mhm.
there are parties involved, both from Israel and from Gaza, who are civilians who have nothing to do with Hamas and the Israeli forces and the military. And those are the populations that we target, and those are the populations that we are trying to defend and serve. So when you talk about like who this land belongs to, like who's fighting who, the civilians and the babies and most of the women, children, the elderly, they're not a part of the fighting. And
Right.
that's where our perspective comes from. Like, at least let us take care of them. It would be nice if they have a place to seek refuge, even if not within Gaza. And what's happening in the Gaza Strip is that the Palestinians inside don't have places to exit to. So that is where there's also our moral compass as humanitarians. Whereas in Ukraine, many Ukrainians, I've watched them go to Thailand, and Russians go to Thailand. I've seen them even go to the U.S.-Mexico border to get asylum into the United States.
Hmm.
And if not, they even can cross easily into Poland. And same for in Iraq, like when the war was in Mosul against ISIS, because it was the war was one city against ISIS, which was the last city that ISIS controlled. But the civilians had a place to exit to, and the humanitarians had a place to retreat to as well. In Gaza, it's very different. It's we talk about it being like an open air jail cell or like this landlocked space. It's because even myself as a humanitarian, when we go in, the world entities like the United Nations and the World Health Organization had told us we may not be able to help you get out if you get stuck, even if you sprain your own ankle or if you hit your own head. So it becomes a very challenging situation because, again, we're here to provide aid. We open a clinic and it's open to anybody who comes to our door. We can't control who actually comes. For example, if no one from Israel wants to come, no one from Hamas wants to come, then they don't come. Majority of the people that we take care of are actually civilians.
Did
So
you
do you,
treat any of the hostages?
We did not personally
Okay.
treat any hostages. In fact, when I was in Gaza, I actually never saw anyone who self-identified as a Hamas fighter or as an Israeli soldier.
hmm,
So we didn't see any of that in Gaza. In other war zones, we actually saw personnel in military uniforms
Yes.
more
Yeah. Yeah.
openly. But
Gaza
yeah,
didn't.
so for
Yeah. Hamas didn't wear uniforms until the ceasefire was decided.
right. So yeah, that's one of the challenges of modern warfare is like, you go back 50, 70 years and it's like everybody had like, this is team shirts or team not shirts or whatever, I'm wearing blue, and so it was easy to differentiate teams for the most part. But the modern age of urban combat in, very confined spaces with limited, resources. And it's like, you've got a lot of guerrilla warfare and it's almost impossible to determine who's actually a
Well,
combatant and who isn't,
yes. Yeah. And I'd like to push back, Nina, a little bit while you're saying that the majority of people in Israel, a majority aren't concerned with politics, and the majority of people in Gaza are just civilians. I think that was called into question. First of all, right, the attack on October 7th, Hamas, there was some military installations that they attacked, but they also attacked clearly just civilians, women and children, and felt that their status as women and children and civilians didn't still qualified them as enemies in their violent struggle, and that they considered them legitimate targets of war, right? And Hamas, we have to recognize, was the legitimately elected government entity chosen by the people of God. They chose, these are the people we want to represent them. Now, can you say, or is it the role of your NGO to not ever say, but do you have any criticisms of Hamas that they have acted inappropriately, that they have endangered their citizens? Or is that something that that's too political a statement to say, have any criticism of Hamas or of the Israeli government?
I wouldn't say it's too political because again, what we end up being is like we're the person in the middle. So I will explain this part how when we enter, I mentioned we work with the World Health Organization, the United Nations, but we actually work directly with Israel
Mhm.
and their panel. It's called COGAT, which is their like humanitarian aid panel, as well as the Ministry of Health in Palestine, which traditionally the public will say like all the members are a part of Hamas. Again, like I don't have like the proof of
Yeah.
that. We actually, like, all of us in discussions, we don't actually discuss that, including the ones from Israel. And I've talked to the COGAT Israeli, representatives themselves. And when we talk, it becomes very much like this is the workflow. Who needs what hospital, what service, what needs to get into the country, what is going to get rejected. So to be quite frank, I am not one to say like who's wrong or who's right for either side. In fact, in many cases and multiple war zones that we've been in, all of the sides that are the aggressors and putting this violence on the civilians from any side, right? And I'm talking about any civilians, any women, children from any side who don't have anything to do with it. Many of the times we say, well, we wish that the people who want to wage war on one another will just keep it within that. Realistically, I know that that may not be the case, right? We know this because it becomes a part of warfare. Attacking hospitals, not only in Gaza, but in other settings, it becomes a part of warfare because now you're damaging the ability of providers, whether they are locals or internationals, from healing the soldiers who are getting injured. So for me to say like pointing fingers or who's right, who's wrong, I personally don't want to see the violence from any side.
Oh yeah.
So
I think we were all abhorred at what happened on October 7th, right?
now, if you speak to, so in getting to know a lot of Palestinians, and again, this is the nature of the setup. I've met far more Palestinians than Israelis. And again, this is a part of the setup. If we were invited, let's say the war was like very equal on both sides, and we were invited to respond on both ends, it usually doesn't happen that way. We were never invited to go to Russia because Russia doesn't it's there.
Right.
So the point is that we have to just watch a lot of innocent people suffer, right? But as humanitarians, we don't, again, because we don't come in with arms. We don't come in like, we're not the ones to take out the bad guys. It's really hard for us. Much. Why not? Because we're not in the military.
Well, what I was saying is I think that the idea of innocence is different in this conflict than we would have here in the West. And it was kind of like when Patton started rolling into Germany, all the Germans they met were like, I'm not a Nazi. I'm not a Nazi. Okay. And right, so right once everybody starts to, the Israeli army enters Gaza, everyone's like, oh, I don't support Hamas. I don't support Hamas. But Hamas considered civilians military targets. But our when Israel considers citizens of Gaza legitimate military targets who are supporting Hamas, is that a fair equivalency, or do you think that if our civilians are equally complicit and war targets, Israel should be able to do the same thing, or is there an unequal sort of targeting of civilians? Because that's the sympathy for civilians was clearly not given by the Palestinians when they started this. Why should Israel hold a different value for Gaza civilians than Gaza held for their civilians?
Let me add a brief stat to frame this context a little bit. One thing that I thought was very interesting was after October 7th, there was a survey done in Palestine, and they asked Palestinians, do you support the October 7th attack? And I think the answer was like 75-80% said yes. Like 75-80% was in favor of that kind of barbarism. And it would be one thing if I felt like, if it was like Hamas was a separate, right, like the separate oligarchy or the separate entity, and they are, they're off living in Qatar somewhere, and they have very little to do with their people. But then, you have, it would be one thing if like all of the civilians were like, oh, we really don't
We just want
side with it.
peace.
We just want
Yeah.
peace. We don't
They
want to have
don't
anything
want
to do
peace.
with him. But unfortunately, it doesn't feel like that when the stats go out, when the surveys are done, and when the polls are taken. It feels like almost all of Palestine is essentially an enemy combatant, even if they're,
wouldn't want peace if it was offered.
right. So
Now, we keep talking about October 7th, and I'm going to butcher the statistics and like the history
Sure.
because, again, it's often not my job to know like all the history of a particular response since I go to so many.
right.
But this goes far back before October 7th.
Oh, yeah.
It is even I've had friends who based in Gaza prior to October 7th of the 2023. And they used to show me videos of rockets going back and forth. So this isn't something that just spawned because of October 7th. There is
Right.
a history. And again, it's not something that I know all of the details about. So it's not like October 7th was a start of this. And when we look at it from the perspective of, let's say, Hamas versus the Israeli military, let's talk only about militants and military, right?
Sure.
Like people who are actually fighting.
Uh,
What we've seen on media, on social media, and really in person, and I don't mean me personally, because like I said, I didn't actually see any soldiers from either side, but is that Israel has a backing of the U.S. And again, I'm American. I was born and raised in New York City. So it's public information, right? That there's billions
we're not
of
disputing that. Yeah.
of bombs. There are tanks and there are soldiers, and there's even when I was in Gaza, there are drones that belong to Israel, and there are quadcopters that shot at neighboring facilities that I was stationed at.
They have a modern
you're talking
Western style army. Yeah. Right. Israel.
So, but then you have groups like Hamas, and even again, if you want to put it into comparison with like groups like ISIS and some of these smaller groups, they don't have tanks. They don't have all this technology with AI and like the drones. They don't have 2,000-pound bombs to drop. So when you look at it from that perspective, and again, it's really not the humanitarian's job to really like analyze this, but it really doesn't look like a fair fight. It doesn't even look like there's anything close to comparison where you're talking about like Hamas attacking on one day and then what Israel has done for the past year. And what I've seen in person, and when you say Palestinians who are a part of Hamas, there are clear children being amputated, clear elderly who are walking with canes who like could not participate if they wanted to, and people that we're seeing in person and treating their wounds, right? So this is where I'm putting the distinction where there is a massive population in Gaza that even if they were recruited, they couldn't have done anything because we're talking about babies, infants, like infants that I've held in my hands who had nothing to do with this.
So to take on your point, sorry, you go ahead.
Well, yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to kind of bring up, and she touched on it, is this. There's this tennis match in this conflict here, and I know that like no matter whose quote unquote side you're on, there's this temptation to like go back in time to the last time that you were the victim, right? The last time that you were wrong. So if you're on the pro-Israeli side, you want to go back to October 7th because you're like, see what happened to us. We have to retaliate. And then if you're Palestinian, you'd want to go back a little bit further. You're like, see the conditions we're living in. We had to do October 7th. And then if you're Israeli, you'd go back a little bit further. And then Palestinian, you'd go back further. And it just goes on and on and on back to the dawn of time. I'm just pointing out that there's a tennis match of everybody wants to go back to
there have been atrocities on both sides, and I'm not here to carry water to say that Israel's done everything perfect. All right, that's not my job. But I do want to ask you this question: do you think, and to both of you, do you think Hamas knew that Israel's military was modern and better than theirs when they decided to initiate an attack? Do you think they had an understanding about Hamas's military? What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, of course they did, but I would.
Well,
of course,
push back. Okay, hold on.
Let me push back a little bit.
Let me follow up. Let me follow up
at all.
What? Sure. So Hamas was.
So sorry.
Going then. If Hamas was fully cognizant, had full awareness of Israel's war-making capabilities, do you think they really had any hope of succeeding in their conquest to drive Israel into the ocean and to conquer and take over government of Israel when they initiated their attack on October 7th?
No,
Do you think they had realistic aims of success?
No, but that wasn't their goal. In my
Guys,
appraisal,
what? All right, well,
hold on,
all right.
hold on.
I
Let
want
me
Nina
tell you what I think their goal was. I
No, I
don't
want
think.
to hear from Nina.
Well, I'll let her pitch it back to you as well. But I think their goal was never a military victory. I think their goal was a propaganda victory worldwide. I
It
think that
starts with
they're
an E, I think is the word you're looking for.
well, that's possible too. But I think that their overall goal was to try to gain like universal global support through the loss of people that they probably didn't care about because they're Hamas and they do have a disconnect from the governing, the governed. So that's just my opinion. I don't know what Nina would have to say about that, but I think that their goal was never to win the military engagement. It was just to put themselves in a situation where their victimhood was so heavy that everybody else is like, no, Israel, stop, and give them everything they want. This is my educated guess.
I want to
also
hear the others.
so to say that they should not have fought in the first place is saying that they don't have a right to fight, right? And the truth is, again, having been in Gaza, the oppression on the Palestinians is real.
Mhm.
Again, they cannot leave freely.
Right.
They don't have the types of passports like us as American citizens have, and also Israelis and Ukrainians and Russians to go to other places if they wish to. And also, at the end of the day, this is all about Palestinians and Israelis saying, like, this is our land, right? I think that a proper question would that we should discuss is, what do we think of a two-state solution, which many people have talked about, right? So that they can exist together, and this was brought up earlier in the conversation, peacefully, rather than fighting and killing each other's civilians, women and children, to claim that this is our land and like essentially push the other out. It won't end well. And to Eddie's point, the Palestinians have gained the support of much of the global community, as you can see through protests, through uprisings, and through support in other ways, even if not exactly military,
Whether
because
they
you'd be
should have
going
or
up
not.
against.
They have a lot of support. I don't think we can definitively say majority. I think there's a silent majority that are somewhat indifferent, and then I think maybe a plurality, especially in the Muslim nations, are with the Palestinians. But yeah, if you were living in Israel, right? So you were living not in Tel Aviv, but out, what would be an acceptable number of terrorist attacks a year that you think, from Hamas that you think would be fine to live with? Just give me a number. What would you think is an acceptable number?
That's not a question I can answer, because when we talk about terrorism, even when we talk about it in the United States, like, for example, I lived in New York City when 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
I also have lived through the history of mass shootings. So what we consider terrorist attacks, whether it's from the outside or inside, is something that is very muddled, right? For me, it is, what is it that we're willing to tolerate as citizens
Yeah,
from our
that's
own
what I want to
governments.
know. What are you willing to tolerate? What is your standard? Is the
I don't
number
want to
0?
tolerate any
Okay, yeah.
world
So the number
from
the number of acceptable terrorist attacks in America and the number of acceptable attacks in Israel is 0.
0.
We can agree on that.
We can agree on that.
Okay.
Yes.
So so now you're back to a two-state solution, right? Now, let's go back a little history right before October 7th. There was a point where earlier in 2022 and earlier, where Lebanon and the ISIS state launched missiles at Israel, and Israel was doing some stuff with ISIS and with Iran, and those agitators wanted Hamas to do some stuff, and Hamas didn't. They said, no, we're focusing on governing our people, right? It was kind of like the first time they sort of like didn't take the bait, like, hey, these people are saying to agitate against Israel. And Israel kind of said, oh, okay, maybe they just want to focus on giving people power and getting them humanitarian services like better hospitals and water and things like that. And so they were giving Hamas a little bit more rope. right? They're like, all right, this is what we want. We like the two-state solution. Let's try to see if Hamas really wants to govern like a legitimate government, right? And so part of that was the respect they were giving Hamas was why there were so few guards around on October 7th, right? Why things were off. They were like, oh, we're having this holiday. Hamas is sort of like, we've been seeing from them that they're backed off. You know, they don't want to do this. And Hamas saw that Israel had given them some rope and weren't like, and what did they do? The first thing they did was they launched a terrorist attack they knew would not succeed, but that would spread terror and would awaken as a propaganda item, right? And so Israel says, look, if the acceptable number for them of terrorist attacks that they are going to live with is 0, then, and these terror attacks are perpetrated by the legitimate government of Gaza, what is their response? Gaza has declared war.
Semi-legitimate.
What?
Semi-legitimate. They haven't had any extra elections in a while, so it's been.
There's still 80% support them. They'd probably win elections, but they were.
Yeah, they would.
They're the ones who are functioning. Israel before was trying to give them the chance to be treated like a legitimate government, and as soon as they got the opportunity, they stabbed Israel in the back and perpetrated this terrorist attack. And so now, all right, so they declared war. Israel responded by declaring war back. And the internationally accepted way to end a war is to surrender. Why has nobody, they've called out ceasefires from Israel, right? Because as you said, Israel's military is vastly more advanced, more developed, and has much more greater war-making capabilities by many, many factors. Why all the pressure was put on Israel to stop? No pressure was ever put on Hamas to just surrender. That's how you end a war. Like Japan surrendered, Germany surrendered, and they're better because of it, right? We help. Right?
Do you mind if I put?
Sure.
Do you mind if I challenge that a little bit? So, it's like one thing I have to acknowledge from Nina is that, you know, it's like if you just want them to surrender, to just lie over and take it, that is akin to saying they just don't have a right to defend their own nation. They don't have a right to self. Let me finish.
No.
So they don't have a right to self-determination. They don't have a right to these things, and ultimately, if they don't, you know, have those things, then did Israel really give them a chance? Did they really give them any rope, or was it like fake rope? I mean, if you're on a leash and I give you an extra foot of leash, that's not actually taking the leash off. That's just giving you a little bit of space to turn around and bite me. And to be fair, you know, that's the first thing they did, and it was definitely not the right thing to do. But
it's not building trust. I mean, but we look back even further to during the Bill Clinton administration, they were offered a two-state solution.
Forget Arafat.
I know, but they were offered a two-state solution. Well, much generous terms than they're ever going to get again. Then they turned it down.
Yeah.
So really, and the Trump administration was actually, they were like, they should have a one-state solution. Because, and honestly, I'm at a position now where I feel like the civilians, the women and children you're talking about, who lives are made worse by this, would be better off living in Israel under Israeli government than living in Gaza under Gaza government. Right? All they have to do. That's asking
people to leave. And
well, move. They're Lebanese. There are Palestinians who live in Israel, Arabs. All they do is they just admit that Israel is a legitimate country and has a right to exist. They, you know, their applications are accepted. The people that are living in Gaza refuse to acknowledge that Israel is legitimate. They could move and live in Palestine. They could call it Palestine and live there, and their lives would be better because Israel is a less corrupt government than Hamas. And that's, you know, less terrorist attacks in their lives if they just submitted to Israel's government.
So one of us who don't live in either of those countries or experience what any of them are experiencing can say where they would be better off. We cannot tell them that, and we have no. no means to have an opinion on that.
Well, I'm
If
I'm
someone
just
came to
using I'm just using your
you're
standard
both
of
good. You're both
accessibility to
Americans.
Real
hospitals.
quick,
Yeah.
real quick. Try not to
Okay.
talk over each other.
Okay.
Let her finish.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, we are in no place to say where they're better off. We cannot turn where the beliefs are or where their land is. So again, in the end, we are outsiders to this, no matter what. Even us as humanitarians, we're outsiders, and we cannot say you'd be better off in Israel or Israelis would be better off if they didn't attack this person or that person. Which is why I said the two-state solution. Again, this is coming from this humanitarian aid perspective where we want to find a solution. And really, in the end, we don't have a say in this, right? This is going to be
Yeah.
with the politicians and the military. What we would like to see is that there would be peace so that we don't have to come into these places and take care of people with mangled bodies. That's really the end of it.
Israel. I think Israel wants peace too.
Well, so yeah, let me ask you this, Nina. Since you mentioned peace and you mentioned a two-state solution, by my count, and this is just since Israel has since they declared independence in 1948, right? So since they were basically given a state by Britain and France or whatever, there have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 peace offers to Palestine, and 6 just outright refusals, 1 acceptance, which immediately resulted in the assassination of the person who accepted, and then it turned into a refusal. And then now we have a ceasefire that's tenuous at best. It does seem like the pattern is that Palestine doesn't seem to want a two-state solution. That's just the pattern. Now, I'm not saying that they don't. And again, I'm not saying that there isn't that dichotomy between Hamas, who obviously has different interests from the population at large. But yeah, so how do you reconcile a peace with someone with a group of people who don't seem to ever actually accept the peace?
Sure. And really from my stance, I can't answer those questions, right? And as you talk about how not all Palestinians want what Hamas wants, not all Israeli citizens, and I know some who lived in Israel, who grew up there, were born there, Jewish, and left because they didn't want to be a part of this violence. And just as Americans may not have the same stance as what President Trump or when it was President Biden or the next president or the previous ones.
Right.
It will never be like the totality of like, this is what all of Palestine want, this is what all of the Palestinians want, and this is what all of Israel wants. Because there are many, many, many Jewish folks who don't want to see this, who don't want to see this kind of violence and wish for some sort of solution. The part where it's like who proposed what is the what's being rejected, what's being negotiated at those tables, I am not as informed in those conversations, and therefore I don't want to speak out of place or to give some sort of opinion or judgment where that's really not my space. Again, we come in and we take care of who presents to our door and where we are asked to go.
Well, let me ask you
okay.
Let me ask you a more broad question then, since we, because I know it is a little bit unfair that Christian, by the way, we didn't tell you in advance, but Christian happens to be a historian, so that's his alley, his
a common historian.
Yeah, sure, common historian. But let me ask you in more general terms, because this is just something I'm curious about in the abstract from both of you. Under what conditions can you acquire land? Right? Like I assume you can purchase it. One of the conditions I would suspect that you can acquire land in is in defense of a nation against an aggressor. Right? And so one of the key problems that Israel is having right now is that they've acquired a lot of land because they've defended themselves. Not because they were doing nothing and then just all of a sudden decided to expand, but because somebody else attacked them, and then in the retaliation, in the recovery, they ended up like securing extra, like the Golan Heights and keeping slots of land that they thought were necessary to their defense. But now, of course, the international community is outraged about this, what they call a colonial expansion, when I don't know, it's difficult to say, but in the abstract, I feel like that's morally appropriate to capture territory while you're defending yourself. Maybe not while you're aggressing, but while you're fighting back.
But Nina, you want to answer this first, or you want me to?
Well, historically, don't the people who capture land, aren't they the aggressors, right? I don't know if you were meant to ask that from historically or like a present day perspective, but in either way, it's whoever is the most aggressive, has the most arms, has the most allies, right, who can do it, because there are other genocides or other wars around the world where there's going to be a clear winner, even if there is pushback,
Right.
right?
Well,
And if you're talking about,
let me clarify maybe, because
go
I'm
ahead.
not
All right.
talking about who's the stronger army, right? Because you may be right that historically, on average, the person who attacks first more often wins, because striking first, number one, is a huge advantage in military. Number two, usually you strike only when you, like, this is art of war. You only strike when you know the battle is already won. Now, this is it's an anomaly in the Middle East because they don't seem to follow that credo. So this is one of the exceptions to the rule. But normally, you're right. Probably, if you're striking first, you are the aggressor, and you also will win. But in this case, this is kind of like, this is the opposite, right? They're striking first, even though they know they'll lose, and they do it repeatedly, over and over and over again. They've done it like 6 times by my count, or 5 times by my count. So it's like, one time would maybe you don't know the strength of your enemy. Twice is like, maybe you're playing a game, or that you're trying to win a larger war. But I don't know. It almost seems like they're suicidal. And I hate to say that, but it's like, I'm trying to figure out why you would continue to attack someone who will continue to beat you over and over and over again. It's mind boggling.
Well, for us, right, again, because we're not party to the religion. We're not Arabs. We're not Muslim. We're not Jews.
Sure, there's emotion involved.
But let's when we talk about conquest, we got to talk about the full history of it, and that Islam is a religion of conquest. It started in Medina. It started in Saudi Arabia.
Hold on now, everybody.
No.
Everybody conquest.
Let me finish my thing.
Okay, all
right.
All
North Africa is not all Islam because the Saracens spread it. Right? They conquered. They conquered Israel. They conquered Syria, Damascus. They conquered out to Palestine. Why is Indonesia Muslim? Right? Because of conquest. Right?
Okay, but do I have to remind you?
Colonialism. So to say that Israel or the Jews don't have a right to conquest and colonialism, when that is absolutely a part of Islam's mantra and history, is right. That's an equivalency you have to accept on both sides.
Yeah,
if Islam can do it,
everybody
Israel
else
can do it as well.
I mean, everybody does it. Right. Every conquest is, but I there's
right. There are consequences for war. Like when Israel wanted peace, right? They got attacked right away, right? By the 7 nations all attacked the Yom Kippur War, and they lost. The consequences of that war was Israel keeps the Golan Heights. Israel keeps these things in, and they're really bitter about that. But it's like, look, maybe you should have just accepted Israel was right in hindsight. And your lives would have been better. You would have more territory, things like that. There's a sort of stubbornness that in the West we feel like, because we see Germany and Japan as examples, and Italy too, of defeated nations that were not obstinate, that kind of submitted to there weren't huge insurgencies. I mean, there were some in Japan, but were huge insurgencies. And then they were able to rebuild and were friendly with them. They're like, and it's like losing the war isn't the end of it. But something here is like surrender. Look, Israel's legit. I get it. How do I make my lives better? Right? It's sort of how we feel in the West should be just the optimal. Right? You won, we lost. We can defeat you. How do we go about making our lives humanitarianly better? How can we have better hospitals, better access to food and water, things like that? And I think Israel would be open to a 2-state solution. And I think too, if there was a legitimate government they could trust to execute that 2-state solution, and not just quietly always building up so that they could, as soon as they have an opportunity, launch a strike, like Eddie was talking about. And right now, Hamas is not a government they can trust. And the leader of whatever the West Bank Party was resigned and so there's no
PA.
actual legitimate government in the West Bank right now. So I mean, tell me how can Israel have a two-state solution until, I mean, it's not like Barack Obama or Nelson Mandela are leading these, or Angela Merkel leading these very rational governments. It's a sort of irrational mind state. How do they do that?
Christian, you bring up Japan, and I've actually gone to Japan many times, and I've met with a lot of their elderly population who survived the atomic bombs and their own wars, who are civilians and not military. I would say the difference is, the way I see anyway, Japan lives without anyone controlling their country. They have their own government. They have their own freedoms, and I really
that wasn't
respect
the way right
that.
after the war. After the war, they had to
I'm
submit
sure today it is like that. So what I respect about their society today is that a lot of the groups that I've met, and I met some Japanese NGOs as well as advocates who are promoting to disarm nuclear bombs and weapons, is that they ask and wish for peace and live in it, and they try to stay away from like foreign affairs in terms of warfare, right? Let's say if you were to say that if your opinion is that the Palestinians should surrender, but they would still be living under Israel's control. And when we talk about like asking internationals to bring in food, water, aid, and build hospitals, like why should we even have to do that? If they could actually live with peace and freedom, they shouldn't require all of these things from external forces. They should have that within, right?
Well,
they should be able to. If you had a legitimate government, they should be able to eventually build all that back up.
I should mention,
and not have it blown up.
I should mention, I don't know if Nina is even aware of this, but a vast portion of the humanitarian aid that's gone to Gaza over the lifetime of Gaza has been from Israel. And not only that, a vast portion of the humanitarian aid that Gaza gets, Hamas siphons away and like lives like kings on. Like most of that stuff does not go to the Gazan people, which is a true tragedy. It's a true tragedy. The whole zone is unfortunate right now. And I mean, I can't tell you guys out there who are watching, I can't tell you how much my heart goes out to you if you're in that strife, but it's a nightmare. And I would say that bare minimum, if there were a two-state solution on the table, Hamas would have to be out of the picture. They would have to be displaced. And that's, I think, the unfortunate situation that Israel finds themselves in is I think they've come to the same conclusion, but they just don't know how to get rid of Hamas because they're so entrenched in tunnel systems under the city, in like hospitals and schools and stuff where they're very difficult targets.
There's not an alternative. There's not an alternative for the Gazan people to turn to right now, legitimate. Like if there was another political party, like, okay, there's, instead of Hamas, there's this people.
Right.
And we'll work with them. They're peaceful, they're rational. There's really nothing but Hamas right now, at least nobody that stepped up. Maybe the international community or NGOs, maybe Barack Obama in retirement or, wants to come in and govern Gaza to a status of peaceful relations with their neighbors. I don't know, but we need somebody, right? Maybe, right?
That.
No, yeah.
Well,
nor is it Arab.
Nor is it Barack Obama's.
We're just trying to look at what it takes for Israel to trust that a government's not going to be hostile to them. If the acceptable number of terrorist attacks is 0, how do we get somebody to come in and lead Palestine in a way that they won't be just looking at when can we do our next terror attack? When they're looking at how can we permanently make our system better.
When we talk about this, when we talk about a two-state solution, is it under the assumption, and not only assumption, but would this be the fact that if there were a two-state solution, that there would be, let's say, the land's divided, the governments have nothing to do with one another, so Israel wouldn't control any. So is that what?
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
So if I could wave the magic wand, right, and just like poof, here's the magic answer. Yeah, I would probably shoot for a two-state solution. I don't like now this is just me being nitpicky. I don't like the fact that the Palestinians are split. I think that either Gaza or West Bank should go away and combine with the other. Right? Does that make sense? Because I don't think it makes sense to have Palestinians on two different sides with this huge swath of Israel in between. That just doesn't make sense to me. But maybe I'm just being pedantic. But yeah, if I could just wave the magic wand, yes, it would be Israel here, Palestine here. And Palestine is 100% independent, has their own infrastructure, does not depend on Israel for food, water, electricity, anything, medical care, anything.
No.
Now, that having been said, like, I don't even know how to, even if the international community installed it, let's say we get our wish, right? Let's say we get this magical 2-state solution and everybody's happy. And then someone from Palestine attacks Israel, as is the pattern. What would we do then? Because this is...
Has there ever been a state solution
Do what?
where has there ever been a 2-state solution where Palestinians were not under the influence of Israeli control?
Yes.
Even if there is a government of Hamas, it has been.
Yes, so several times actually. Although, to be fair, I don't know. I mean, it wasn't Hamas, but I don't know if there's, when you say government like Hamas, I'm not sure, how broad that can get. Because there's definitely been situations where it wasn't Hamas.
Was Egypt.
Part of Egypt. Egypt had it at some point. Jordan had sway of the West Bank for a while, and so there's been varying times when, and it's funny. This is a side note, but it's funny that everybody is upset about Israel being in Palestinian land. Nobody had a problem with Jordan being in Palestinian land or Egypt being in Palestinian land. It was only a problem when it was a non-Arab nation being in Palestinian land, non-Muslim nation. So that's a kind of an awkward international community problem that I don't know where it comes from exactly, other than maybe anti-Semitism.
Now, may I ask if you know the question to this?
Sure.
Would you say that the treatment when, again, I don't know the full history, but let's say when Egypt or Jordan was in charge of Palestinian land versus when Israel was, would you say that the treatment was about the same, like the rights of the Palestinians were the same, or was it different? And therefore, why there is such a different, let's say, acceptance or lack thereof when one took over versus the other?
I can only really speak to Gaza history, right? Egypt controlled Gaza, but that was when Egypt was ruled by the dictator in the 60s that was not a very good guy. So nobody really had rights. And it was kind of military control or whatever. And they launched the Yom Kippur War from Gaza.
Yeah.
And part of the consequence of losing the Yom Kippur War, right, because Israel actually conquered all of Sinai and could have kept all of the Sinai Peninsula. Right?
They gave it back.
But decided to making peace with Egypt, they'd give it back except for Gaza. And there were Israelis living in Gaza for a long, long time. Finally, they eventually in the 90s, early 2000s, they finally pulled out and gave Gaza fully over to the Arabs there. and have attempted to try to give them a chance to build, right? They get so much aid, they get all this money. To say, like, okay, if we're not living amongst you, can you build something and have your way of life that's nice enough that you don't feel compelled to attack it, right? Hey, we'll even help you out with power, things like that. But it's still like, and here's one of the.
I'll give you another.
One of the things that, I'm sorry.
No, yeah, well,
but that's in sort of. I wouldn't necessarily say that coming back to the original point, that the Gazans had full democracy and fantastic rights under Egypt,
right? Well,
but they were at least being governed by an Arab.
There was a small point of time where I think in 2005, where Israel actually went in and forcibly removed every Israeli from the Gaza Strip, like literally went in and ripped people out of their houses just to give Gaza a state. And for, I think, 4 years or something like that, basically Hamas had full control. Gaza had 100%. There was no Israeli presence at all, like zero presence whatsoever. And there was even, believe it or not, there was actually even some solid infrastructure that the Israelis had set up inside the Gaza Strip. And instead of utilizing that infrastructure, there was like some nice houses, a school, and I think a hospital. And instead of utilizing it, the moment the Israelis had been wrenched out, Hamas came in and burned everything, like knocked it all to the ground. So it was like their one opportunity.
The ideology mattered.
where they just did not want that infrastructure because it came from tainted, I don't know.
When you say Israel wasn't present, do you mean just physically in terms of people who live there?
I mean,
but
so
technically, still,
They weren't the
Israel,
police. They weren't
Palestine was
governing.
still territories.
yeah, so there,
Is that right?
so there's two different time periods. So there were 4 years, I think 3 or 4 years, where Israel was 100% missing. There was no like defense forces on the perimeter, and there was no blockade on the sea, and Hamas had access to at least leave through Egypt at the time. Well, semi-access, because Egypt at that time didn't have great relations with them, so it was kind of hard for them. But they could get out if they wanted to. They could leave. They could go wherever they wanted, basically. They were even allowed to go through into Israel if they wanted to, but that was just like almost never done. Now, then after that, those 4 years, then there were 16 years where Hamas had full sway. The moment Hamas got into government, they started launching terrorist, like low-level terrorist attacks, and then Israel immediately put them on that lockdown. Which, here's another question I would ask you is, yes, they were living in terrible conditions, but isn't a prison where we put people that do terrorism? I mean, isn't that what you have to do to protect yourself? I don't know the answer. I mean, maybe there's a better answer, but
well, not everyone there is a part of,
sure,
let's say,
but
the terrorism.
what's the alternative?
Not all of them.
Sure,
right?
I agree 100%. But what's the alternative?
Only imprison those who have committed crimes, as we normally do.
Okay, so
in society.
So then,
rather than like in America, you wouldn't imprison the whole state because 10 people in New York State were mass shooters. You would go look for those and then put them in prison, and not put the whole city or state into prison.
I agree. That's what they're doing right now. Or
what do you mean that's what
up
they're
until
doing?
like 2 weeks ago, but before the ceasefire, that's exactly what they're doing. They were
rooting out.
They're rooting out that group of 10 people, or what's actually more like a group of 2,500 or 26,000.
They've also killed
lots of people.
How many hundreds of who are having again, and who blatantly, some from one-on-one attacks from soldiers, not even, and we as humanitarians knew this, that per Hamas target, that there was actually a number of casualties involved.
Oh, yeah.
Again, like, this is not something we have an opinion on. It's a fact that we know.
Oh, yeah.
But there are quite numerous accounts where there were, again, like, children and women and elderly who clearly are not here to fight, or don't have the capacity to, or the disabled, and they are targeted.
Oh, yeah.
This is, again, on mainstream media also.
Let me clarify.
Like, children who obviously are not anybody.
So let me clarify. And now, not as positive. In every war, there are going to be these outlier events where people do crazy stuff on both sides, like sexual assault or something like that, or shooting kids or something like that. That's going to happen, and that's horrible. And I 100% condemn that, no matter where it comes from. Right, like no matter where it comes from. That having been said, on the whole, at least from the evidence that's gathered by the international community, Israel has gone to extraordinary lengths to try to limit civilian deaths. Now, in a war, it's just going to happen.
Military.
But like they'll do these tactics. I don't know if you're familiar with the way that they do it, but one of the things they do is something called a roof knocker. So they drop this bomb on a building, but it doesn't actually damage the building. All it does is make this super loud noise, and it alerts people that in 15 minutes that building's going to go. So please get out. Right? They'll also drop leaflets. They'll drop like these like pamphlet, like shreds of thousands of pieces of paper that fall all over the land, saying, this zone is going to be targeted next. If you're a civilian, get out. They even made phone call. I even heard a phone call the other day. I listened to a call where they called this building. This is amazing. I had to share this with you. They called this building and said, this building's about to be targeted. You need to get out. And the guy that answered was obviously like a Hamas operator. And he said, no, we're not going anywhere. I'm not telling anybody. And he's like, you don't understand. Everybody in that building is going to be dead, and maybe even a block radius in every direction. And the guy says, well, it'll make for better propaganda worldwide. I mean, when I heard that, I'm like, oh my God. See, to be fair, some of these deaths are
definitely... They don't value...
Like, how do
they don't value the lives of their citizens.
Yeah, I mean, it's terrible. It's truly unfortunate, and it breaks my heart. I mean, I just don't know but I don't know the answer to that. Like if you're Israel and you're
So
trying to route
the
people out,
unfortunate part,
You're
as you
asking
mentioned,
for
Eddie,
Israel to
that
care more about the lives of their
true.
citizens than Hamas.
It is true that leaflets are dropped, and in other war zones, this tends to happen too. Leaflets are dropped, and then civilians are given a chance to leave. But so, as I think you both know, the Gaza Strip is actually not that big.
right?
So there aren't a lot of places to run to for refuge in the first place.
Sure.
And I'll give you the example. In Mosul, leaflets were dropped, and then civilians were allowed to migrate out of that city and go somewhere where there wasn't active warfare.
Right.
In Gaza, even for humanitarians, if a place were to be attacked and if the message didn't reach or there was just nowhere else to go, the Palestinians aside of Gaza cannot go to physically right now, cannot physically go into Egypt, cannot go to Israel, cannot go to Jordan. So no matter where an attack is, they have to just like move from one condensed space to another. And as you mentioned, it is unfortunate if they're not alerted. But, I think the leaflets are only done every once in a while. It's not like a constant thing where
Right.
it's like, all right, we're going to come attack this building now. Now, please leave. The messaging doesn't go like that.
Sure.
And to make a phone call to one person and then expect that person to relay the information to everyone, as you just told us, like it doesn't happen. So
right.
this puts once again, like where my focus is those people who really just want to live and have like food, water, shelter, education, healthcare, and don't want to see any of this and don't want to see their children die, see their mothers and grandparents die. Where does this leave them? Because they don't have a choice. They don't have a place to go. They're not responsible for, let's say, not responsible. They might not even be receiving some of these calls and messages, and they don't have the power to do anything about this. They just have to sit through it and accept this. They have nowhere to go. That's the difference between this
They can
and
emigrate.
where can they go? They physically cannot leave.
No, I'd have to
There's no
challenge
way.
that.
There's some people
Evacuation, even no. This is very important because even children who've had all of their limbs blown up may not get to evacuate with the help of internationals, with the United Nations and World Health Organization. Even if they're accepting facilities around the world, may not get to leave the Gaza Strip to get health care somewhere else. They cannot leave freely. They don't have that right. They simply do not.
Not anymore. They don't. At least at some point they had semi like a partial right to immigrate.
At some point when Rafah border was open, if they could fork up $5,000 to $10,000 per person, then they can cross and not legally and not gaining any kind of
my gosh,
residency or any kind of rights in Egypt. Exactly. That's and a lot of families in Palestine did not have that kind of money in the first place. And as soon as Rafah closed, you would be stuck there, Eddie. As soon as Rafah was last May, not one single person, unless they were one of the lucky ones who could get evacuated because of medical reasons, not one person could opt to actually leave, even if they wanted to. Let's say they wanted to leave Palestine themselves or with their families as civilians or with their children or with their parents. They could not go from any direction outside of Gaza. Even fishermen who went too far into the sea were shot dead. And this is, again, public information.
Yep. No, you're right. And so let me turn the question back around on you then. What do we do about that? Because here's the problem, right? We've got this dichotomy of necessity, right? On the one side, we want to preserve as much life as possible. But on the other side, we must get rid of Hamas. Otherwise, they're just going to continue to keep shooting Israel every year or whatever, right? So what's the answer, right? Because I don't see another solution for Israel. The only thing I could think of was, I thought, in my opinion, the only other extra step they could have taken was to send a special ops team in and lose it, because they would have lost it. It wouldn't have been successful, but they should have at least done it, in my opinion, to show the international community that they're willing to go that extra length and sacrifice their own spec ops teams just to try to do this surgically, and then default to a non-surgical answer when the surgical answer doesn't work. Now, this is just my military knowledge talking. I know for a fact that it doesn't work when you have that large of an insurgency. You can't send a spec ops team in and kill 26,000 combatants. It just doesn't work. But they should try. That's my thought. Now,
so when we're trying to preserve life, at the very minimum, those who require healthcare or those who wish to leave and not be a part of the warfare, not to be a part of the fighting, they should have an option and a route to go and not have to pay $1,000 to $10,000.
quickly.
That's, I think, the bare minimum humanitarian aid.
Let me quickly clarify and ask you. So when you say, let's say I am a combatant, right? And I'm not going to say I'm a combatant. I'm a combatant, right? And I lost a finger, right? And I'm seeing you, and you're helping me out, and I say, you know what? I'm not part of this fight. I want to leave. You help me out?
It wouldn't be my decision because we actually can't help people leave.
Like in the abstract, would you say that is a person who should be let out?
If you came to me and said, I am a combatant and I want to leave.
I say I'm not.
No, he's saying what?
I'm lying to you. I'm lying to you, but
I'm saying is that we're not in a position to detect, even if you were an undercover soldier from either side, we wouldn't be in the position to say like, oh, well, I'm going to like try to do a background check on you or figure out who you are. And that's assuming that humanitarians had the right to give a pathway. 9 times out of 10, we will never have that. We'll never be doing that on our own. There's going to be a government entity involved, even at the U.S.-Mexico border. We're never the ones who are like, hey, let me get a migrant into the U.S. No, there's going to be lawyers involved, CBP, Border Patrol, and other entities aside from us. So I don't think we'd ever actually be in that position where we'd have to be the one to make a decision and say like, oh, well, I actually think this person is in the military or a terrorist or blah, blah, blah. Like we wouldn't be in that position. So that the hypothetical doesn't work in this situation.
I apologize. I didn't necessarily mean you personally, but what I'm saying is in the abstract, if we're trying to get people who are injured out of combat, right? Like out of the nation, out of the area so that they can go be somewhere else.
Sure.
But it lets Hamas slip through the cracks. Doesn't that defeat the point?
That's saying that the greater good should be sacrificed because like if you're talking about, let's say 1.5 or 2 million humans, right, Palestinian, how many of those are expected to be Hamas, right? 50,000 that's like saying, well, we must exterminate the 2 million people in order to take out. That is actually the military's responsibility to filter who their targets are and to take out those targets from any side, from any part of the world. This is the military's job. It's not to, I mean, the reason why people are calling it a genocide is because there is no discernment between like who is a civilian and who is the target. The whole place has become a target, including humanitarians. Humanitarians have been killed, just so you know.
So let me challenge that too, because best counts we have, there are roughly 45,000 Palestinian deaths at the moment. Now, understandably, that's going to like probably triple over the next couple of years as the indirect deaths take place, and people who have sustained
and likely not accurate,
right, lethal injuries and stuff like that. Probably people that are in the process of being hospitalized right now and stuff like that.
People who are in the rubble or the miscalculation of the weights of the dead body parts and
it's
stuff. Like
unfortunately that. Because we don't know exactly who Hamas is and who's a combatant and who isn't a combatant. It's very difficult to tell how many of those were actually enemy combatants and how many of them were not. But that we're still left with this paradox of what does Israel do? Because if they can't get rid of Hamas without this kind of conflict, I don't see an alternative. I really don't. And I hate to say that. I mean, no, I don't want them to. Now, let me ask you this question, because I think this gets better to the point. If they've only killed 50,000 or so, or maybe even 150,000 of 2 million people, isn't it obvious that they're not trying to kill everyone? Like, isn't it obvious? I assume Israel could, in fact, glass all of Gaza. I think they have the artillery. If they wanted to, tomorrow, Gaza could... It'd be Lake Gaza, Gulf of Gaza, whatever, sure. Right? Now, that's worst case scenario. And I don't think Israel wants that, which is why instead they've only killed 50,000 or 150,000 or whatever the number is. It's definitely not 2 million.
I believe the number is much higher, even on paper. But I think, I believe the number is closer to 400,000?
What? So,
and again, I don't know Exactly.
Nobody knows, because the
No,
problem
no,
is the international community says
there's a
45,000.
lot of propaganda. Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course Gaza says it's like outrageous, because that's the game, right? And both sides are probably lying. Both sides, like both sides are probably playing this. I wish I hate. Yeah, Christian.
So, my argument is not necessarily with you. I think the work you're doing is great, and I think that you need to
amazing, by the way,
just passionately serving people, and I think it's completely appropriate that you don't ask what their involvement is. If they have injuries, you treat them. If they're things like that. But right, when you talk about, all right, they have freedom to fight, freedom of action, or freedom, right? Yes, they have freedom to do that, but there are consequences to exercising that freedom, right? What Hamas has done is try to exercise that freedom and then complain about the consequences of that exercise. And then expect Israel to care more about the lives of their citizens than they care about their citizens. Now, a little more history too. One of the reasons why Palestinians can't leave is other Arab nations don't want them.
Yeah.
They have a history, unfortunate history, of being very problematic for any country they go to. Right? When they went to Jordan, accepted large numbers of them, and they immediately destabilized the Jordanian government.
Yeah.
They go to Syria, they immediately destabilized the Jordanian government. And that's why Egypt's like, look, we don't want large numbers of these. That's why Saudi Arabia doesn't want large numbers. And Saudi Arabia, right, has finally decided that they would rather have open diplomatic relations with Israel, a real government, than Hamas. And it was, I feel like, that this terrorist attack was propagated because those relations were about to normalize between Saudi Arabia and it wasn't anything about achieving ends or exercising their will to fight any of their propaganda. It was they didn't want Saudi Arabia and Israel to have diplomatic relations. But Saudi Arabia, they know the new government in there is becoming more liberal, and they don't want anything to do with Palestine. They have judged that they would rather make peace. They would rather live in Israel, under Israel, than live in Gaza under Hamas. Saudi Arabia has made that decision.
So, Christian,
and I feel like, sorry.
Well, what do you think that what's your solution?
Right, so, well, the solution is,
because you're still stuck with Israel having in a conflict, and you're still stuck with. I mean, again, I encourage you to remember that Hamas and its people are two different. Even if they support that action, like via a poll, which we don't even know if that's accurate, because all this information is a game. But
you need to have a filter, and everybody's got to say, do you want to live in peace with Israel? Can you swear that Israel has the right to exist and I will live in peace with Israel? Or do you? If you don't, then you're on this side and you want to fight Israel, right? If you want to fight Israel, we will consider you a legitimate combatant, and those are the consequences. You accept those consequences, right? And those that want to live peaceably, that they allow them, right, to live in peace.
I don't think that works. Right? Here's why. Because what's going to happen is, again, Hamas is going to lie, right? They're going to say, "Oh no, I don't want to fight. No, I want to live peacefully with Israel. I want to be friends. I want to be friends." And then you say, "Okay, well, you're on this side. We can make you a state." Or even if they assimilate into Israel itself, Israel proper, it's still the same thing, because then you still got a group of people who claims they have no beef, and then they've got beef.
Their line only goes so far. They will not lie to take an oath that Israel has a right to exist.
You think?
Right. That's part of the application for Arabs to live in Israel. Right. They have to swear an oath to it. Right. Just like American citizens become an American citizen. Right. You pledge allegiance to the flag and you acknowledge, right, that Israel having that same thing, saying, hey, you can become a citizen, but you have to acknowledge that Israel is a legitimate country. They won't do that.
You don't think anybody would slip through the cracks?
Well, my solution predicates first on that, right? And then secondly, creating, and probably it will probably take an Arab or Muslim Mandela figure or something to come in that wants to lead them, who is not obsessed with revenge, who wants, right, what we wants the humanitarian situation to improve, and wants to end the terrorism, but also accepts that a zero number of terrorist attacks, the acceptable number of terrorist attacks is zero. That leader has not emerged, right?
Well,
and they sent a very chilling by assassinating the person that seemed to want to reconcile with Israel, getting assassinated. Can a leader emerge from Palestine that is for peace without being, facing violence from within his own community?
That is, all right. Well, let me ask you this, Christian. So I think one of the obstacles to this peace is that I think Israel, I mean, we just lost Nina for a second. Hopefully she'll come back. But anyway, yes, there she is. Yeah, here she comes. No, it's like, one of the obstacles to this peace is Israel does this game where they encroach on land, right? So like they still have a lot of settlements that they're adding in the West Bank.
Yeah. In the West Bank, especially. Yeah. I can't carry water that Israel is doing everything perfectly. I'm not saying.
But I mean, that's one of the big obstacles to this peace. I mean, I think if you wanted to if Israel wanted to be serious about it, 100%, and don't get me wrong, because I don't think either side's very serious, but I think Israel's closer. But if they wanted to be 100% serious, they would say, all right, as part of these negotiations, we'll remove those settlements. And
yeah, but that's happening in the West Bank. They're not doing any settlements in Gaza. And the government. Well,
I don't know though.
Well, before this October 7th attack,
maybe
this was not in response to Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip. And so the West Bank has largely been, they have their own problems, and it revolves largely around corruption. I think that's sort of different. The crisis right now is in Gaza. That's where you're doing your work in Gaza, not in the West Bank right now. And the West Bank doesn't really have any leadership right now, right? Because their leadership resigned. So I think specifically, I don't think this response is about misdeeds Israel's done. I think it is an existential terrorist attack just about Israel existing, and a sort of a culture where they bond over their sort of hatred and anger over Israel. And it is an emotional, it is not based on reason. They know they're going to lose, but they just still want to do this aggression because it's cathartic or feels good to them.
Yeah, but
and to treat people, it's sort of like, all right, here's I had a friend who was Irish, and Ireland's doing really well, but still it's like a bonding moment for other Irish to get and talk about the injustices that were perpetrated upon one by the British Crown centuries ago.
Right.
And it's like a bonding thing to get fired up and hate the British. But then they sort of all go home after that. Like they're
okay, but
they're not even bombing in Northern Ireland anymore. This is still, it's a bonding thing, that anger against Israel, but they're acting it out inappropriately, and we need a leader to help them find a peaceful way to release that anger.
Well, I agree that we need a peaceful leader, but you don't think that Israel has that same kind of like bonding and I mean, maybe they didn't to start, but now they've had to endure 6-7 wars. They've had to endure so many terrorist attacks. You don't think that kind of thing happens in Israel too? I mean,
I think there's some. I think some factions. I think there's a lot of Israel is a lot more liberal, right, and not as monolithic. There are obviously the Orthodox and the very conservative hardline Jews, and the party that Netanyahu is based in. But there's lots of political parties that have a lot of different lines. I can't paint everybody in Israel as the same. But Israel also we're asking them to be magnanimous because, they know they have the superior fighting force. But they're still asked, they still, what Nina said, the acceptable number of terrorist attacks is 0.
Right.
Should there be things that Israel changed? Yes. I can't say, right, the settlements, everything are beyond dispute. But Hamas's activities are not going to change that. And they really aren't even, I don't think it's disingenuous to say that they're in response to Israel's bad settlement policies.
Fair enough. Fair enough. What do you think, Nina? Well, I still see a paradox here, and that is,
Okay.
the number of terrorist attacks acceptable is zero each year, but also the number of civilian casualties is zero, right? Like either way, we've got an acceptable number that can't be met, right? We know that there are going to be terrorist attacks, and we know that there are going to be civilian casualties. I don't know how to.
We want we want the Palestinians to care about the lives of their citizens.
Even
And
so,
they
they're
think
still
about,
going.
hey, how about we don't do this attack so that our citizens will live?
That's crazy.
They
Tough.
seem to want Israel to care about their citizens' lives more than they do.
And Israel does.
If it were
What do you think?
simple, there would be a solution,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
So, like, I
Yes.
think in summary of what we've talked about, like, we all want to see both populations, so let's say both Israel and both Palestine, to be able to thrive on land that is considered theirs, however it's designated, and for them to coexist peacefully. Unfortunately, it's not the case today. And there's only so much that I think we as civilians can debate about it. A lot of this is going to be out of our power. It's not going to be, we won't be the ones who can appoint or like facilitate this. Even
Right.
the world and their governments are trying to. Though we can only hope that, from my perspective, I can only hope that more people who are not involved, while there may be casualties in war and in, unfortunately, these kinds of conflicts around the world, one can only hope that fewer people who really, and I mean legitimately, have nothing to do with this, who aren't lying, who aren't like trying to cover up,
Right.
who legitimately like have nothing to do with this, who like don't even want to be a part of any of the violence, who don't, like the goal would be to have as many of those people not be a part of it as possible, who don't have to suffer from this.
Yeah, I agree.
That is my.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's common sense.
I wonder if there's a way to like make a little buffer zone, or like a
demilitarized zone.
demilitarized zone, right? Yeah, or I don't know.
It would be fantastic.
I'm
but
spitballing.
No.
One thing I wanted to talk about today is the propaganda side of this, because it's like we mentioned now, a lot of this information is difficult to trust because we don't know where the source is. And I mean, I can't tell you how many times over the last like 2 years or a year or two that I hear, oh, Israel blew up the hospital and killed 50 kids. And then we find out actually it was Hamas that blew up the hospital with 50 kids in it, and vice versa. Like on both sides, that's happened like maybe 20 times. And it's like, it just keeps flip flopping. And I have no idea who's actually giving us accurate figures. And one thing that I wanted to target though are the words used. So one question I have is, why do we keep using the word genocide when, like I said, Israel has the ability to commit genocide and is specifically not doing it?
We say genocide because people aren't allowed to leave and therefore are at risk for getting killed. And again, including humanitarians, right? We're not in the part of the genocide. But also, there have been, I mentioned earlier, there have been some attacks that blatantly were not necessary. And I'll give you the example, Al-Mawasi, which is the area that is on sand. There are no tunnels under. They like physically couldn't exist. But large bombs were dropped there, so you could see the actual like crater that it made. And some of my actual like, people that I cared for in terms of like patients and civilians lived in those tents. When we compare this to like what with the technology and the personnel, like the United States can send the Navy SEALs to go through mountains and like through mud, through caves to take out one target. Why would such an aggressive move to drop a huge bomb in a place that clearly is like, whether there's Hamas in there or not, like it wasn't necessary to use that kind of force? And when you talk about hospitals being attacked, if it was attacked by an airstrike, then it was Israel. It wasn't Hamas, because Hamas doesn't have planes. To my knowledge, they don't have the capability to airstrike.
It wasn't an airstrike. It was a
having been in Gaza and seen the airstrikes myself and seen them take out buildings next to me, these are clear attacks that do endanger civilians around. And again, like being on the receiving end, where I see the types of patients who come in, many of them wounded children, and some of them, schools being attacked and whatnot. So again, like when it comes down to like the down and dirty of the warfare and saying like who's allowed to be a casualty, like that's not for me to say. Like I can say what I wish wouldn't be, but that's where the term will come in, genocide. Like let's say those who wanted to leave, let's say there are families and they want to leave, and forget the part about, again, like let's say like none of us here are in charge of identifying who may be,
Right.
in the military or not. If a family is, let's say someone designates like they're safe to leave and they want to leave and they don't want to stay in this place where they might get killed, then I believe if that were the case, then it wouldn't be called a genocide, because civilians have had the chance to go seek refuge somewhere else. No matter where it is, and forget who's accepting what. Like this happens in other places. They again, like Ukrainians have gone all over the place, right? And you're not going to see a camp with Ukrainians in it, and you'll never see all the Ukrainians trapped in one place that Russia was attacking. They've always had places to go to have safety.
So it's the ability to escape, you think, that makes, or the ability to like evade.
Absolutely.
It's interesting because I don't know that comports with like the textbook definition of genocide, but I guess I can see
it may not. That's my take on it. From again,
sense.
Like having the and seeing like multiple war zones where that seems to be the fair thing to do. Now, again, like if it's your argument, Eddie, where it's like, well, in order to capture everyone who we consider the enemy, we don't let anyone out, then that's like not a decision of mine.
Right.
But what
Women
we
and children
say is fair.
Yeah, well, even women.
Like,
say everybody under the age of 12, every
people who clearly do not pick up a
12.
gun and like shoot you.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
Until
unfortunately, the sad truth, and I hate that this is the case, but unfortunately, there's a very, very large number of women and minors who are combatants and are very, very much in favor of the Hamas regime. But that aside,
Child
yeah, I wish there
soldiers
was.
exist.
Now,
Child soldiers
Christian, you
exist.
mentioned like this.
I have not seen any, but I don't deny it. I have not seen it or heard about it, but again, I don't deny it, and I do not deny that like being in other places where there are like child soldiers who, unfortunately, some of them even without their opinion are forced into these situations.
No, let's say there was a camp set up on the Red Sea in Sudan, Muslim country, and everybody in Gaza was allowed to immigrate there and recreate their thing on the Red Sea. How many people do you think would take up on that? You think all the innocents would?
There's two ways to do this. One is to escape from the direct violence. The other is, as you're saying, is to basically like set up a home somewhere else. And in that case, if you're talking about people like the entire population, whether they are Hamas or not, saying like, well, I'm going to leave my land because I don't want to be a part of this and I'm going to go somewhere else. I don't see that happening, because that would be like forfeiting your home.
If
right?
you want peace,
again, like,
if they want to live in peace, what better to live in peace? That's why people came to America. That's why so many people have fled war. That's what the definition of a refugee. If there's war and there's not peace here, if I have self-determination, it's why we crossed the sea and came to America. Why my ancestors did was because we could have self-determination. I feel like if you can still be a coastal community. There's a big unsettled section of the Red Sea right there, Sudan. Live under Muslim rule. You're still relatively close to things around there. Why not do that? And I think the obstinacy or the emotional, what you're talking about, and I object to the word genocide because I feel like it's an emotional thing that has a lot of baggage tied to it. And I wish we could use terms that were not as emotional with describing this conflict, especially when it comes to solutions. But I would like to see the option to have aid coming to build a city in Sudan along the Red Sea.
Do you think Sudan
and give them a chance for that?
So you're saying you would like to see them leave and
give them the freedom to. Well, if they want to end violence, and they want to live in peace is their aim,
and is that
give them the option. Those that want to stay, those that want to stay can stay and fight. Those that don't want to fight can go there, and then when the guys that want to fight win the war, they can come back. But while we're fighting, right? The people that are innocent that have no part of fighting, let them go live in Sudan.
I think.
Then when the fighting's done and the battle has been won, they can return to their land.
I don't think Sudan's going to.
And of the places you pick is Sudan, as if Sudan doesn't have its own issues.
Well,
Yeah, I don't think
but
so.
it's sparsely populated, and especially does not have population along the Red Sea there.
Let's,
Oh, I mean, but I can say Egypt, but Egypt won't trust them because they have a history of
yeah,
being
nobody will try.
a
Well,
disrupting government.
do you think that then it's
The
is it
consequence of their
appropriate then for
actions.
maybe
It's not
UN and or like America and NATO or somebody step in and say, hey, look, this is where it's going to be, and that's it, guys. Period.
Where it should be is
America
Syria.
is
With Syria,
Israel.
they should ship them to
America
Syria.
So, wanted. So,
Syria has its own issues. America would not be the party because America is backing Israel
Right.
and quite
Right.
publicly. United Nations doesn't have power to stand up to Israel and the United States. This is a fact. This is a fact. In
Right.
Gaza, UN trucks are shot at, UN workers are killed, and even they've told there's a clear lack of power for these global entities like the World Health Organization and the United Nations. Whereas in Ukraine and Iraq, missions that were backed by the United States, where US soldiers were involved and where billions of aid went to these countries, there was more power given to the World Health Organization and the United Nations. This is something that's not talked about a lot, but it's surfaced much in the past year. And again, it shows where the power in the world is. So again, I really don't think that we will be able to find the solution to say that they should go somewhere.
Wait,
Well,
wait. Are you telling me that
hypothetical.
are you telling me that we're not going to solve a 3,000-year-old problem tonight? Is that what you're saying? That's insane.
Was that your hope?
Yeah, I really thought we could lock it down in like 2 hours. I thought, bing, bang, boom. We'd just call, we'll call Gaza and Israel and be like, listen, we got it. We got it all set up.
This is how we're going to split the land.
Here's the common sense thing that I would ask, right? How many Muslim nations are there?
Yeah, it's like,
how many Jewish nations are there?
Right.
Can there be one Jewish nation? Right, there are plenty of Muslim nations. The idea of
not so
the
easy.
idea of Gazans going to another Arab culture that speaks Arabic like they speak, that shares a common religion, that they would be safe under, is much more plausible than, right? Can Jews go to Egypt, Libya, Morocco safely? Sudan?
Jews have
Saudi
gone to
Arabia,
Thailand, America, and plenty of
Thailand's not a
countries.
Muslim country.
So would you say?
Right? I'm talking about in the Middle East.
No, I'm saying Jewish people from Israel have the ability to travel to many more places and to go live there if they wish to.
Well, let me ask you, Christian. Since you asked Nina earlier if she has any critiques about Hamas, do you have any critiques about Israel and the way that they've prosecuted this war? And
yeah,
but do you have any?
Like,
what do you think they should have improved?
Well, I mean, yeah, hindsight being 2020, they should have had better readiness to address the
well, sure,
the thing initially, so that the atrocities and the hostages didn't get taken, and that could have kept the scope of it down. As soon as they breached the fence, right, if there was an immediate forceful attack of identified combatants, then this would have gone nowhere.
Right.
Now, Israel, right, has tried to prosecute the war under they as legal as they can. They declared war in their Congress, their Parliament, made it clear that they were prosecuting this as a declared war, not just some special military option like Putin says, or anything like that. The rules of war, and this was in response to a direct act of war by it, right? How have they dealt with Hamas in every single attack appropriately? I can't say no, yes or no, but I can say that Hamas has chosen that they would rather have had these consequences than no.
Well, what
I
about
think they accepted those consequences?
What about the specific charge of the fact that they're not treating the civilian population, the declared non-combatants, as declared non-combatants? Like, what is there room for improvement there? Could they have?
So it's a cultural difference between us and the West, and that we, right, and the line is much blurry over who is a Hamas supporter, who is a Hamas combatant, especially because they don't wear uniforms like Israel does. They're doing guerrilla warfare. They are happy to have human shields. Are happy to have civilian casualties because they know, and it's we don't want the rest of the world does not want innocents and does not want civilians who are not party to this injury. They know that will trigger an emotional response. But if the only way to resolve this without emotions is that the people that perpetrated this war must surrender.
Yeah.
Or what they've done, right? They've reached an agreement where they've given back the hostages. They could have given back the hostages at any point.
Some of them. Some of the hostages.
Well, yeah, the live hostages, if they were serious about having the ceasefire, they wanted this conflict. They want this. They wear this as a badge of honor. This is a type of. They would rather have open conflict, even at the destruction of the nation, and then spin it for emotional sympathizers such as Nina or the world, then go down and have a delicious fish dinner and walk down by the beach in peace, which is what we as Westerners would really like to experience and really like, hey, if you're in Gaza, do that.
Right.
And there's no need. Why do you need to launch rockets? You're in a pretty good place here. Just make this as good as it can be.
So
why do you have to drive Israel from the river to the sea?
So yeah, let me ask Nina. So with regard to that, I mean, this really is all hinged upon one thing, and that's just a surrender, right? Like the conclusion of this war, what was going to happen as far as massive casualties on even Israel's side too, but but I don't understand why all of the propaganda is aimed at all of the things that Israel is doing wrong and completely overlooks just the one key issue that if Hamas had surrendered immediately, almost none of that happens.
They could have saved the lives of their civilians.
Maybe this doesn't come from a humanitarian perspective, because normally we wouldn't comment on this. But to say that Hamas should surrender is that they shouldn't fight for their land and for their country.
Well, that's fair. But
not when they can't be successful, when they know they can't be successful.
Well,
I'm sure in the history there have been people who fought wars, groups who knew they were not going to win, but out of,
like
loyalty,
the 300, they accepted the consequences.
out of time.
Christian, one at a time.
Yeah.
You have to, yes, if you're going to fight for something, yes, you sometimes do have to accept the consequences. And again, I don't think this would be the first time. I think in our history, it wouldn't be the first time that a group is trying to fight for their land and trying to fight for what they think is right. And again, both sides are going to think they're right. No matter what, both sides are going to think all of this should be their land.
Right. No,
so,
I mean, it's not even the first time.
Who are we to say who should surrender and who should fight? This is
It's
their
not-
They lost.
fight.
Well, it's not even the first time.
Did they accept the consequences of losing?
Yeah, that's the real thing.
Who accepted? Do they accept the consequences? Is what you're saying?
Do you think they should accept the consequences of losing a war? Yeah.
I will not comment on what they should or should not do. Again, I don't wish to have wars and violence.
Right.
But and I'm not in their position. I couldn't even imagine myself in that. But if I were fighting for something that perhaps I cared about passionately, and I knew that even my death would be the result, for example, me entering Gaza, I could have died. And this is I'm fighting for my cause, which is humanitarian aid.
Right.
But I choose to do that, even if I will leave my family behind, even if I have all of these luxuries in my life, I could go and have a very easy life somewhere else. So in that sense, it would be if you ask me, why, people do ask us, why do you go into an area where you could die just to help people who are not related to you? It's not about that. I'm also fighting for what I believe is right. And yes, I could die in the end for it. So I don't put myself in a position to say any of these groups should or should not, or should surrender or should not. They're fighting for what they think is right. And in the end, my opinion doesn't matter, because I'm not a part of their culture. I'm not a part of either side's religion, culture, what their beliefs are, whose land, what this. So it's as simple as that. I have no comment.
Well, I think it's just general Western. If you say you're going to shoot a gun at somebody with intent to kill that person, you should accept the consequences of if you fail to kill that person. he's going to shoot back at you, and you have to say, "Whoa, hey,
Right.
what are you doing?" Right, or that when he shoots back at you and he misses, maybe there's unintended consequences.
Right.
You're like, oh, I didn't think that maybe, right? So the
So
short-sightedness of Hamas, maybe they didn't consider all the ramifications.
I
Is
have to
not
think.
Or maybe they
necessarily a
considered
defense.
it, and maybe they've considered it, and they are
Just
choosing
were
to fight for
well.
their
So
land.
here's the thing.
That's possible.
It would be so. The way it's depicted, it's like the propaganda is such that Hamas are like freedom fighters, right? Like they're the oppressed group. And one of the problems we run into in today's society is that there's like this automatic favoring of an underdog, right? It's like the moment you are an oppressed group or a victim of any sort, and we can see this all in American politics everywhere. It's like all of a sudden you gain moral value, even if there's in the abstract there is nothing there. It's like just like Gaza humans are just as valuable as Israeli humans. There's no difference in the moral value of that human life. They're the same. They're all humans, and they're all worth what human life is worth. But it's like just because they're the losers, all of a sudden everyone jumps on the Gaza train, and it's like I saw it in Ukraine too. It's like everybody hopped on the Ukraine train and put up all these Ukraine flags just because they were the weaker force, not necessarily because in Ukraine it was a lot easier to determine who's right and wrong. But in this case, one of the biggest problems is, I think, in your case, like when you come as a humanitarian to give of yourself, that's a choice that you make to make a sacrifice for yourself. But when you go give a humanitarian aid, you're not sacrificing your family. You're not sacrificing your friends. You're sacrificing yourself. Hamas is sacrificing their family, their friends, their people, because Hamas is in Qatar living like kings. Right. So that's the big difference here. And I don't find this is one of the things that frustrates me with the propaganda here, is because they're treated like they're this liberation force when in reality they're huge, rich oligarchs that are living in a different nation that are sacrificing people that have nothing to do with the conflict, and they know it. Like they knew that's what was going to happen. It's not like Hamas didn't consider it. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew that the consequences were going to be a minimum of like 20,000 dead fellow brethren. And I can't imagine a person who does it. But of course, I am coming from a different like culture.
Preach, my brother, preach.
I don't know. I mean, I just want the propaganda to reflect fairly the moral sense of what's going on here. I mean, no matter how you figure it,
I mean, in theory, not in theory, in actuality, all of it is propaganda.
Yeah.
Like all of media is controlled one way or another. Like we don't know what the truth is. We don't know what the true figures are. We don't know what all the facts are. So it's really like all of it is propaganda. You don't know who's telling the truth on social media.
Yeah.
And then on mainstream media, somebody who has much more wealth and power controls the voice of the folks who actually appear on television.
Right.
So I think to say that propaganda is only coming from one side would be hugely inaccurate, because all of it could be propaganda. And we as civilians, whether you are a historian or you've read up every single textbook or published novel, it doesn't matter. Like we're fed what we're
even
fed,
those could be
this
wrong.
Is what we're let.
It's true. I mean,
we're not the ones in power.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, and that's the perspective of this podcast. We're the common people, and this is sort of like the common viewpoint of people around the tables, not the sort of idiots that Jay Leno puts a mic in front of.
Yeah, right.
Above average. Eddie, while he doesn't have as much college education maybe as I have, is one of the most naturally intelligent people you'll ever meet. But the common people of high intelligence, who, I'm gathering that, who think about these things, and there's certain things that especially our Western civilization culture just can't understand and appreciate about Middle Eastern culture, the level of intrigues that they are steeped in and are willing to accept, and the level of sacrifices, sort of level of violence that they're willing to accept, is not something that really aligns with us. And I think when we look at it, we want to pass judgment and say that that's lesser, and that's maybe not necessarily correct. But as common people, we really think at this point, the way forward is to act like the rest of the
The world.
peaceful world.
Right.
And I feel like Saudi Arabia is trying to set that example that, hey, you can be a good Muslim and you don't have to hate Israel as part of your identity, right? You can, we can
Well, let me
do
comment on
that.
that. You cannot categorize all of the Middle East or Muslims, or even like when we talk about the peaceful world. I mean, America is certainly not one of those.
Nah, that's true.
I feel
Interesting.
less safe in the States than I do when I am walking around a park in Iraq at midnight.
Interesting.
And as of like
Wow.
the last
You
few
feel
weeks,
less,
around
well,
10 p.m., 3 a.m. in Jordan, a Muslim female colleague and I would walk around at 10, 11 p.m. Nobody bothers us. I've never been attacked. I am in New York City right now, and I am always constantly watching my back. More people have approached me in this city and been hostile to me, and even like in Texas, than when I was in the Middle East. So
no,
there
that's
are
unfortunate.
it is unfortunate, but there are peaceful people in
Oh,
America. It's not everyone's pocketed into one
Right.
category.
Yeah. Huge difference between me here in Cary and like 15 miles over in Durham. It's like, whoa, night and day difference. So yeah. And of course, New York City is a massive people. So the population's going to play a part. But listen, we didn't solve it tonight, but I think we had a fantastic conversation. All right. That's it. That's a wrap, guys. I'll catch you next time on Common Mansplaining. Thanks so much for coming, Nina.